There is a double standard of excellence, the one of obligation, the other of perfection. The former lies in keeping the commandments, and nothing less can suffice for salvation. If thou wilt enter into life, keep the commandments. Matthew 19:17. The latter lies in keeping the counsels, and that's what we profess. If thou wilt be perfect, go sell what thou hast. So that'd be Matthew 19:21. None are bound to this or the other of the evangelical counsels, unless, like religious, they have freely vowed themselves thereto. And in this case, their observance also is necessary for salvation. Deuteronomy 23:21 says, when thou hast made a vow to the Lord thy God, thou shalt not delay to pay it, because the Lord thy God will require it. And if thou delay, it shall be imputed to thee for a sin. Now, somebody made a comment recently on one of the videos that we put up, and I think it was a lady, but it might have been a guy, I don't know, right? But the person said, this is for people who want to be saints. I don't want to be a saint. No offense or anything. Now, it's true, we don't have an obligation to heroic virtue. We don't have an obligation. We don't have a strict obligation to heroic virtue. But I was thinking about this. So no one has an obligation, except for religious who vow it, to follow the evangelical counsels strictly. All have to follow the counsels, but not as strictly as a religious. Like, people in the world don't have to go sell all they have and give it to the poor. Though our Lord says, at one point, he says, little children, fear not. No, it says little flock, fear not, for you have a Father who loves you in heaven and wants to give you an inheritance, right? And then he says, so go sell all that you have and give it to the poor. That's he's telling that to normal people. He wasn't saying that just to the ones who would come and follow him. He's telling that to everybody. We forget about that one. We really do forget about that one. The counsels are for everybody. The strict observance of the counsels is for religious, right? We get a double sin if we don't follow them. The people have to still follow them. They don't realize the idea with the people is that they actually think, this is a more modern thing, Christians until more recently didn't think this way, unless they were bad Christians. But the idea today is, I don't feel called to religious life. So therefore, I'm allowed to keep one foot in the world and one foot in the church. They tote this line where they can kind of have their cake and play with it too. Is that the... No. Have their cake and eat it too? Yeah. Have their cake and eat it too. And then they got the other foot in the church, which means it's the same thing. It keeps the conscience from rebuking them. They're making their obligation. They're trying to keep the commandments. But here's the question. If you keep one foot in the world, can you keep the commandments? Because if you look, our Lord says, people when they think of the commandments, they think of the 10. And that's true. Those 10 commandments are the 10 commandments. But then you look later on in the Gospel of John, where our Lord says multiple times, if you love me, you'll keep the commandments. Okay? So the commandments, keeping the commandments is our love for our Lord, and our love for our Lord is keeping the commandments. Do you see? So there's more to it than just like, yeah, I haven't killed anybody. Well, detraction's in there too, is murder. There's all kinds of other things that are in there that aren't just that plain, like, yeah, I haven't killed anybody. So when we look at the two different things, the obligation, it's not so much that the obligation is on heroic virtue. That's what a saint has to prove. You have to prove that an individual to become a saint has practiced heroic virtue. So it's not required strictly that the lay faithful practice heroic virtue, but follow the commandments. And if they did love Christ, they wouldn't have a foot in the world, because St. John later says, anyone who loves the world is at enmity with God. In other ways that he says it, just read the epistles of St. John. So we can't just say, well, I'm not called to heroic virtue. I'm not called to this striving like these friars are talking about. I'm just called to something a little bit more simple, where I keep a foot in the world and I keep a foot in the church. I'm a good person. But let's look at it. When our Lord says, strive for the narrow gate, because large and wide is the road that leads to perdition, and many are those who fall into it. And then another time he says, because they say, Lord, will few be saved? And if you think about it, there's a lot of saints. But you wonder if they're just the few. Because will the few be those who have a foot in the world and a foot in the church? Or will the few be those who just are fully, completely in conformity to the church? And I don't mean the church of the weirdness today, the church that Christ founded, that we know is the true church, and we know the proper way forward. But to love God, to practice the faith, to donate ourselves completely to Him, to be open and disposed to His graces, to live only for Him and not be afraid at all to die, because we get to go to heaven when we live that way, right? That's for the few. But those who keep a foot in and a foot out, you wonder, are they going to make it? That's the sad thing about that comment from that girl, or I think it was a girl, that left it on the quote there. I'm not looking for that. I'm not looking for being a saint. It's like, well, St. Paul called us saints. He referred to the Christians alive as saints. That means the ones who are practicing the faith and loved our Lord, they were the saints. So, anyways, we do have the vows, and so we have a greater responsibility. And I think part of that responsibility too is so that we can show a light forward for the faithful on how to live the things. It is possible. Now, our life is set up in a way where it's more possible for us. So we're able to donate ourselves more heroically, and hopefully that gives them the courage to do that as well.